Here we go. It's a bit windy this morning, so hopefully you'll be able to hear. There's obviously, you all know, there's a federal election in the air. We've got the phony pre-election war going on, and on one side we seem to have a Prime Minister and a Cabinet that's going around the country saying, we'll promise you this and we'll promise you that, in terms of allocating resources. And on the other side you've got a opposition leader who is trying to generate as much hate and division in the community as possible in order to push him over the line. But what you don't see is policies to deal with the issue of increasing inequality causing entrenched privilege and social dislocation. I'll repeat that again. Increasing inequality causing entrenched privilege and increasing social dislocation, which manifests itself in many ways. But ultimately, in terms of hatred and division within society, where one group blames the other for the situation we find ourselves in. But nobody is willing to look at the root causes of this increasing social inequality. And if you've got an election that means something, you do need candidates who are willing and able to deal with this situation in terms of putting policies forward to people, to electors in this country, which will go a long way to breaking down that social inequality, that economic inequality, which will break down economic privilege and decrease social dislocation in the community. So it's very easy to criticise. Anybody can criticise. It's a bit more difficult to actually look at the situation we find ourselves in and come up with some type of analysis, and even more difficult to be part of a process when you ultimately know that your candidature will not lead to an electoral victory, but what it may lead to is a change in the discourse. Because although the fourth estate is owned by the small section of society that owns the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication, the fact is that through social media and through old-fashioned discussion and meetings, that the political agenda, social agenda, cultural agenda can be changed in order to tackle the increasing economic inequality which exists in our society. Societies function best when the question of economic inequality is dealt with. They function worse when entrenched privilege continues to be a central feature of our day-to-day lives. Now, I'm not talking about some developing nation with extraordinary debts and minimal resources and huge populations. We're talking about 26 million, possibly 26.5 million people living on a continent which is resource rich. An educated public which seems to be dragged into these rabbit holes of division and hatred, which are being exploited by an opposition leader who believes that his party, the Liberal Party, and their associates, the National Party, can win the election by pressing all the wrong buttons. So, how do we go about challenging, at least intellectually, challenging the current discourse, challenging the direction the political debate will take in this country in the next few months, where it will be reduced to a contest between two leaders. One, the Deputy Opposition Leader, who has the total support of the corporate-owned media, and the other, who has little, who finds it difficult to articulate any reform propositions because of the prospect of electoral defeat. So the question comes to us, not progressive independents, not minor political parties, but radical independents, to look at the nature of our society and to put forward ideas which will help to break down the increasing economic inequality which has become such a central feature of Australian life in 2025. So what am I talking about? Well, firstly, during a federal election campaign, it's almost impossible to tame any oxygen in the corporate-owned media and the government-gelded ABC. But we do still have a process via which candidates, with a little bit of effort, can find themselves contesting particular electorates. Now, most federal electorates have over 100,000 voters, which is an extraordinarily large number to influence. And it's becoming increasingly impossible or difficult for independents to find themselves on the ballot paper. A registered political party has the luxury of doing bulk nominations. Independents, as far as the House of Representatives is concerned, need to obtain 100 people within that electorate to nominate them, who are on the electoral roll, to nominate them to stand, and they need to fork out $2,000 for the privilege of standing. That's the reality. That cuts out a lot of people who've got something to say but would find it difficult to overcome those hurdles. But the effort is necessary, because what we are seeing in our society through the development of silos within social media, we are seeing the creation of groups within our society who only talk to each other, who only think the same way, and who refuse to interact or become part of everyday life. Their major aim is to control the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication, and multiply their power and wealth. We see it all around us, not just in this country. But as I live here, and a federal election is around the corner, this is the time that we need to see more radical independents stand, not because any of them will win a parliamentary seat, but because we need to change the debate. So how do we go about this? And that's an important question. How do we go about this? What are the policies that break down increasing economic inequality and help social cohesion and destroy entrenched privilege, which has been created by increasing economic inequality in the community? With the rise of social media and now artificial intelligence, we've now come to a situation in our history which we haven't seen for over 2,000 years. The Roman Empire consisted of patricians and plebeians, and initially, before its expansion, the patricians needed the plebeians to create wealth. With the expansion of the Roman Empire and the introduction of mass slavery of conquered people, the plebeians were removed from the economic equation. Although they were still politically important, they had no economic stability. So in order to maintain that political stability, we saw the introduction of what could be described as a universal basic wage. People didn't need to work anymore for the Roman Empire to expand, but they were part of that political process. So we saw the growth of subsidised housing, subsidised food, 240 plus public holidays at the height of the Roman Empire, the old bread and circuses. In 2025, slavery is not a major issue around the world, although slavery still exists. But the major issue is that unless you have inherited wealth, you are part of the wage system. You need to be part of the wage system to survive, even if you're in small business. So, the first policy to break down economic inequality is the introduction of a universal basic income, which everybody receives. This would free up tens of thousands of public servants to do more worthwhile work than checking on people. It would ensure that everybody had more than the basic necessities of life, and it would ensure social cohesion. Because while the wage system is the only way to survive a reasonably comfortable lifestyle, we will have major problems as fewer and fewer people are needed to work and earn wages, which will increase to increasing social dislocation, loss of cohesion, more hatred and despair within the community. So the first policy, as a counter to the introduction of artificial intelligence, is the concept of a universal basic wage. How do we fund this? How do we fund this? How do we fund this for everyone? Obviously, people who continue to be part of the wage system would pay some or all of that universal basic income back in taxes, but it still leaves the dilemma of how to fund it. Well, it's interesting that we have a goods and services tax in this country. That's right, a goods and services tax, which has the major impact on the people who have the least. But there are no real financial transaction tax and a salaried taxation system which basically meets basic necessities, because the corporate sector, and let's not forget 1/3 of corporations paid no tax legally last year, pays minimal if not voluntary taxation. So a 1% financial transaction tax on every financial transaction over $5,000 would raise anywhere between $80 to $100 billion a year. we would see this, we'd also see a tax introduced on stocks and shares for all Australian citizens, whether in this country or overseas, a 1% stock market tax. Every time you buy or sell a share, 1% goes straight to the Treasury. And considering this part of our existence is fully computerised, it's a relatively easy tax to collect. The next thing I'm interested in as a radical independent is the type of economic system we have. Through the globalisation, corporatisation, deregulation and privatisation revolution that's swept across the world, and especially in Australia, what we have seen is the loss of competition, the destruction of a mixed economy. And the private sector, the private investment for private profit sector, now monopolises every aspect of our existence, whether it's health, whether it's food, whether it's early childhood development, whether it's aged care, and the list goes on and on. So we have now a situation where we need to create a third tier to the Australian economy and resuscitate the public sector in terms of the public owning, through the Constitution, essential services that are required for people to survive, exist and prosper, in many regards like we had in the past. Things like a publicly owned bank, a publicly owned airliner, especially in a country like Australia, publicly owned essential services, and the list goes on and on. And the third tier of the economy, which needs to be expanded dramatically, is the collective and cooperative sector, which is almost non-existent in this country. And to do this, you need seeding funding, and no financial institution provides seeding funding to a cooperative and collective. And I'm suggesting that 1% of superannuation contributions should be set aside to act as seeding funding for cooperative and collectives to set up a third tier to the Australian economy. So you've got the public sector and the collective and cooperative sector competing on an equal footing with the private sector. Something else that I've been interested in over decades is obviously reaching some type of agreement with this country's First Nations people. Every time this issue is raised, is sabotaged by a variety of ways. And Dutton's road to the lodge is based on the sabotage of attempts to somehow begin that reconciliation process, a reconciliation process based on justice, not charity and handouts. I'm also interested in the concept that this country is a relatively poor country where 1/3 of the population rely on social security benefits to survive. Another 60% are wage earners who lead a hand-to-mouth existence trying to keep the wolf from the door, while 8% are part of the investment class who have enough disposable income to use this country's investment-friendly laws to enrich themselves. And obviously, I don't even need to mention the 1% that own the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication, who've been the greatest beneficiaries of privatisation, corporatisation, globalisation and deregulation. So as a radical independent, I'm suggesting, demanding, that this country's natural resources are reclaimed by the people of this country, that we nationalise without compensation all the major resource entities in this country. That's right. Nationalise without compensation all mineral resource entities which have a turnover of more than $100 million. Because ultimately, this country's natural resources are a significant part of our Commonwealth. We do live in the Commonwealth of Australia, but the Commonwealth belongs to the 1% that owns the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication, that have reduced the parliamentary system, that have reduced our political representatives to parliamentary puppets who basically work for them, not us. These are just a few ideas. They're not new. They're not my ideas. They're ideas which circulate on the very margins of discussion, what little discussion occurs in this country regarding how to tackle growing economic inequality. But these are ideas which need a hearing. They deserve a hearing. They extend the debate. They will stop the descent into barbarism which we now face with increasing population growth. An economic system based on the creation of ever-increasing profits irrespective of the human, social and environmental costs which has given us the climate emergency. An earth with limited resources. That's right, limited resources, growing population. So ultimately, the question is up to you. You can be a passive spectator. You can get involved in the parliamentary process. You can be involved in discussion to actually widen the debate about what is necessary in this country in order to create a cohesive society which tackles the issue of entrenched privilege and economic inequality.